To begin, I thought we would talk, I just wanted to continue really our conversation from Tuesday about anonymous sources and recap a little bit and then talk a little bit more about the use of sources and then walk you through the Times ethics guidelines and the way that we have attempted to deal with these issues at the Times. So to begin, I'll just remind you that basically at our last session we talked about 3 case studies. I gave you the hypothetical of the council member who gives the information to a reporter, then turns around and lies about whether he is the source and in fact accuses someone else of being the source. There's the case involving Judy Miller where she went to jail for 85 days to protect her source, who turned out to be Scooter Libby, who ultimately, after getting his permission, she identified in the course of that proceeding. His sentence was commuted. She did more time than him. And then finally, the case of Wenho Lee, who, as you'll recall, was accused, or the New York Times wrote a story suggesting that there was spying going on at Los Alamos. He was then arrested, was put in solitary confinement. Ultimately, all the charges but one against him dropped. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of mishandling information, and then sued the government, but needed to get to the journalist to figure out who in the government was responsible for the leak of information about him. The journalists and the government essentially split the settlement in that case. But no journalist ever revealed the source. So that's sort of 3, very complicated ways of addressing the issue of anonymous sourcing. I would just point out to you, and this recaps a little bit from last session, but there are real common features throughout those, even though the facts of them are obviously different. In each case, there was a promise made to a source in exchange for information. That promise was to protect the source's identity. And then that promise is made under one set of circumstances, but then as the circumstances change, it becomes, for one reason or another, difficult to keep the promise. In the hypothetical, the source presented this, gave the reporter information about a hearing, but then when the source lies about it, that changes the understanding of what that initial promise was. In the Miller case, it was Scooter Libby offered her information as a lead to pursue. It's tested, the promise then is tested when it turns out that actual conversation between him and her is arguably a crime in itself, a crime by him, not by her, complicated in addition in her case by the fact that she never wrote a story about it. In the Lee case, it's a little harder to know what the changing circumstances are because we don't exactly know, we don't know who the source was and we don't know really how the circumstances changed, but I think it's probably fair to say, given the sort of totality of that case, that it was probably, the source was probably motivated by trying to show that the government was taking his case seriously, since the New York Times had accused the government of foot-dragging on it. But then the circumstances of that promise change as the case against Lee kind of falls apart, and now it's Lee who's looking for information, not Lee who's the subject of the coverage. So the question I think that all of those pose is, how do you protect against a changing circumstance? You can't know as a reporter what the future is going to be. You can't know as anyone what the future is going to be. Given that you can't know all the circumstances that your promise might be tested against, you have to go back to the promise itself and try to work out or anticipate difficulties in that initial conversation. And the problem with that is that the ideal solution from a reporter's perspective, from the reporter who wants to protect him or herself going down the road, is not ideal for getting the information. Because what you would like to be able to say to a source is, tell me this information, I won't use your name unless it gets too difficult for me to keep your name secret, in which case I need your permission to release your name. Well, I guarantee you sources are not going to go for that. That is a guarantee to not getting the information. So instead, what you need is something that stops short of that gives the source some reasonable assurance of anonymity and the reporter some protection against manipulation or a radically changed circumstance. I would submit to you that I think the answers there then are to have a clear, plain conversation with the source where you both have no ambiguity about what the promise is you're entering into. And by the way, I'm talking about this from the perspective of the reporter. This would also be true in the event that you were a source in a story. If you found yourself on the other end of this conversation, it's equally important to insist on sort of clear, plain language so everyone knows what's going on. From the reporter's perspective, I would say that the imperative is to say and make clear to the source that if you tell me the truth and you continue to tell the truth, I will keep your name out of the story. It's also important to tell the source that you're not going to keep that name to yourself only. It's quite possible that an editor at your paper is going to ask you for the name, particularly if this ends up in court. Editors are not going to want to defend you not knowing what they're defending or who they're defending. And it's almost certain that you will, if you end up in that circumstance, have to tell a lawyer, or at least be asked by your company to tell a lawyer. You can always refuse to tell, but you will soon not be a reporter. And it's also important to be clear on what binds you to this promise. Is there any circumstance in which you and the source would agree that you could void the promise? Now, the one we've talked about most often is the source who lies. But, it is also not inconceivable that you would say to a source, listen, I will protect you all the way up until the point that they want to put me in jail on this. At that point, would you be willing to come forward? And if the source says yes, then you've relieved yourself of a potential problem. So my point here is that the terms of this agreement are less important than that there be clarity on both sides about what the agreement is. This is not just sources saying, I'm going to tell you something off the record, and then going forward. You're entering into a contract, you're entering into an understanding, and both sides deserve to know what the deal points are. In the event that you do enter into one of these understandings, then it's incredibly important to take safeguards to protect the understanding. Yes, please.
If the journalist tells an editor in the event that they would go to court later on, and the editor leaks it out, if the journalist is in trouble?
Excellent question. The privilege is what we call this the reporter's privilege, extends to immediate supervisors and lawyers. So you can't just go tell every editor in the building. At the LA Times, I don't know, there's probably 100 editors, maybe more, I hate to think. But someone who is directly in your line of responsibility, someone who needs to know this, is also bound by the privilege. Now, it's true that that person could violate your deal. Once you've told them, you have no hold on them. He could go run into the court, and I'll tell you a little bit more in the Miller case. Well, actually, I'll just tell you now. In the Miller case, I call it the Miller case, it's really the Scooter Libby case, Matt Cooper of Time Magazine also was subpoenaed in that case. Matt Cooper also refused, as did Judy Miller, to provide the name of his source. But he had taken notes on a company computer, and against his protest, Time Magazine turned the notes over. Now, I'm going to talk, I will say go through right now things that you can do to protect against that happening. But in fact, it is true that once you've told another person, you've kind of lost some control over the information. When you're talking to the source initially, the source should know that. Because it is, I as an editor would not publish a very sensitive story or a very sensitive piece of information in the newspaper by a reporter if the reporter was unwilling to tell me how he or she got it. So at some point, you're not going to have the option of just keeping it to yourself. I mean, it depends on the information and the sensitivity, obviously. But your source should know that you are probably not going to be allowed to keep that person's name strictly to yourself. And there's some risk to that, obviously. So once you've entered into an agreement like this, what is called upon you, what's demanded of you, is extreme discretion. You can't tell your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your best friends. You can only tell people who directly need to know this in your workplace. The reason you can't is that if you're lucky enough to get in front of a judge who will respect your privilege when you say, I don't want to reveal the source, if the judge then asks you, have you revealed it to anyone else? And you say, well, I did happen to mention it to my girlfriend over dinner. Well, then you've waived your privilege. Whatever privilege that judge is entitled to give or is inclined to give you is now gone by the wayside. Because if you're going to tell, unaffected people, then you've waived any right to claim that privilege in court. I can tell you, I think I may have mentioned it the other day, in the 14 or 16 months that I covered the O.J. Simpson case, I never talked about a source or my conclusions about the case to my wife, to my friends, to anyone for just this reason, that there's an absolute imperative that you be discreet. I would add to this, and it would not be popular with my managers, with the publisher probably at the LA Times, but I would not trust your company. I would not trust the people you work for in all of this to protect you for precisely the reasons that Matt Cooper discovered, which is that the interests of the company and your interests as a journalist may diverge at some point in this. Now, this gets tricky because the company will be helping you throughout, hopefully. The company would, if you're working for a big news organization, they will probably pay for your legal defense. That's incredibly expensive. And so You may be in a situation where the company is helping you and you are defying the company. Got to do it anyway. If you are serious about the promise you made, and you have to be. I would go so far as to say that there are tracks that you need to cover when you do this. You need to not, if you're going to meet a confidential source, you shouldn't do that on a company credit card. You shouldn't be calling that person on a company cell phone. You know, you need to really take this seriously because you are entering into an ethical, contractual relationship with another person who stands to be hurt if you fuck it up. So you can't. So you really need to treat these seriously. And as I say, they are rare instances where this all comes to, you know, where this all reaches sort of the maximum boiling point. But you don't know when you enter into that deal at the, you know, police academy bar, telling the cop that you keep his name out of the story. You don't know a year and a half from now where that's going to end up. So you need to be really careful at the outset, and you need to behave appropriately once you've made the deal. So with that, I would love to turn, and any of you who happen to have brought your ethics guidelines with you, feel free to follow along here, but I'll read from them anyway, so if you don't have them, don't worry. I'd like to, there's no section, or actually only one section of the LA Times ethics guidelines that are more exhaustive and elaborate than that of anonymous sources, and that has to do with conflicts of interest, which we've talked about a little and we'll talk about more. But the section on sources is quite detailed, and I thought I would walk you through it just really a piece at a time and talk about how each of these provisions came to be and welcome your thoughts on any of them. Before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about how these guidelines came into existence. Back in the late 1990s, the editor of the LA Times was a guy named Michael Parks. There had been a scandal at the Times, and we're going to read about it later in the course, known as the Staples scandal, where the Times shared revenue from an issue of the magazine with the Staples Center. Again, we'll talk about that more later. But one of the ramifications of that scandal was that it caused people within the Times to want to go back and revisit some of the fundamental ethics of the place. So Michael, then the editor, convened a group of journalists at the paper to go back through what were then our existing guidelines and try to modernize them to make them more relevant for the Times in the late 90s. A bunch of us worked on that for a while and developed a sort of draft of guidelines. Before we were done with them, the paper had been purchased by the Tribune Company, and Michael Parks had been replaced by John Carroll, who was the editor who came in I think it was 2000. They sort of sat for a while. John was not sure whether we needed a written set of guidelines. He had a strong internal sense of ethics and what he wanted journalists to do and how he wanted them to act. So he wasn't convinced initially, I think, that we needed a written set of guidelines for the staff. Over time, he became convinced that we did, and so we restarted this process, and I think it was like 2003. At that point, John convened the senior editors of the paper for a series of meetings to talk about issues in ethics. I joined that group. I was not a senior editor of the paper, but I joined that group because I had been involved in the drafting of the initial set of guidelines, the draft that we were working from. So over a series of, I don't know, maybe half a dozen meetings or so, we debated a bunch of issues in ethics. At each time, then John and other people would suggest language. I was asked to then put that language into a document, and then we had an editor, Mark Duvoisin, who edited this draft with John. So the final product really reflects this sort of group wisdom or lack of wisdom about what ought to be in our guidelines. There was a desire throughout this not to try to list every situation that could get you in trouble, because there's always a danger in a document like this that if you list all the things that you can think of that journalists shouldn't do, that then people will feel free to do anything that isn't in the document. And that wasn't the idea. It wasn't to try to do a list. It was to try to articulate certain principles so that people would have a kind of baseline of how to know a baseline of how to act and a sense of when they were close to the line and ought to talk to someone about it. So with that is what motivated this document, which was then adopted, I think in, the date on it is May of 2006. I think that reflects an update since then. I think that it was actually done more like in 2005. But in any event, it took a year or so, several months anyway, to put this all together. The source section of this was particularly honed in that period. Many editors at the paper had thoughts on it. So it, as you can see, is one of the longer sections, as I just mentioned. So let me go through the sourcing piece of this, sort of thought by thought, and toss it to you as well. The first, it begins with, we report in environments, Hollywood and Washington to name two, where anonymity is routinely sought and casually granted. We stand against that practice and seek to minimize it. We are committed to informing readers as completely as possible. The use of anonymous sources compromises this important value. Okay, stop there for a minute. That is an attempt to get at something we've talked about, or I've talked about a couple times now, which is that our obligation to uncover and report the truth is in some way compromised by the use of anonymous sources. But let me call your attention to the language of this. This does not say, because it compromises this important value, we don't do it. It doesn't say you are prohibited from using anonymous sources, because it says that we stand against the practice and seek to minimize it, and that while it is routinely sought and casually granted, that we're going to try to do something other than casually granted. That is an attempt to achieve the kind of balance that I've been trying to talk about here, which is that we want to use anonymous sources when it's important to get information, but we don't want to use them just because it's an easy way to get information. And we recognize that it compromises the full disclosure. Next couple sentences. These standards are not intended to discourage reporters from cultivating sources who are wary of publicity. Such informants can be invaluable, but the information they provide can often be verified with sources willing to be named, from documents, or both. We should make every effort to obtain such verification. Relying in print on unnamed sources should be a last resort, subject to the following guidelines. Okay, again, before we go on to the actual specific guidelines, the emphasis here is that this is not a prohibition, but it's also a last resort. And that's the kind of finesse that we're trying to work our way through on this, I think. Okay, so here are the specific guidelines. When we use anonymous sources, it should be used to convey important information to our readers. We should not use such sources to publish material that is trivial, obvious, or self-serving. Okay, so the point here is importance matters, right? I had when I first started at the Times, I worked in Orange County, and there was a government official in the area that I was covering who used to pull me aside after meetings and say, I need to tell you something off the record. And I would say, oh, okay. And he would say, I think this is a great idea. And I would just be like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, people sometimes want to go off the record because they think it's sort of sexy and fun. And it's, they feel like they're sort of, Woodward and Bernstein or Deep Throat. That's just dumb. And I would say to him, you don't have to say that on the record or I'm not going to use it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You got to be, one sort of threshold here is don't use a dangerous device to report something inane. The only reason to do this is to get stuff that you can't get otherwise. And you need to, at some point, if you cover a beat, as I have for most of my career, you deal with the same people over and over. So you might have that conversation one time where he says, I want to tell you off the record, I think my colleague is terrific. That's when you say to him, that's not something you need to go off the record for. You can say that publicly. You can sort of school people over time. In any event, that's the point of that language, is to just remind you, when you're in one of these conversations, that you need to use this technique for something you can't get otherwise. Next piece. Sources should never be permitted to use the shield of anonymity to voice speculation or to make ad hominem attacks. It's funny, I read this in preparing for this class today. I have to say, I think it's one of the rare instances in which the guidelines use the word never. And if I had to do it over again, I'm not sure that I would have used that. I'm not sure how that got in there. I would agree that it should almost never be used, but the use of the word never always freaks me out a little bit, because it's always hard to know, it's very hard to know, when a circumstance might arise that would test that. As a general principle, though, I certainly agree with this. What you don't want is a source who wants to use anonymity to knock someone else down. So in the hypothetical that we talked about the other day, you don't want the city council member to come to you and say, off the record, I got to tell you, my colleague was an idiot in there. He didn't understand anything. He didn't understand the rules. He got everything screwed up. And then you put all that in the paper, and then the person he's talking about either denies it, or of course probably denies that he's an idiot. And then you're the one left holding the ball on it. You can't you can't hold the source accountable because you've agreed to let the source be anonymous. So I would certainly agree with the sentiment on this, that you shouldn't, as a principle, be letting people use their anonymity to denigrate others. Any questions at this point or through here? Okay. Next, an unnamed source should have a compelling reason for insisting on anonymity, such as fear of retaliation, and stories should state those reasons when they are relevant. This is, I think, an interesting part of these guidelines that don't exist in a lot of newspaper guidelines. Because what that suggests is that you have to have a conversation with the source about it. You've got to know why the source wants to be anonymous. And you got to know before you agree to protect the source's anonymity. So, now this conversation with the source is getting longer, which is hard because you don't want to slow it down. At some point you want this conversation to end with you getting a piece of information. It does, though, require you to ask a question, which is, why? Why do you need to be anonymous? And then it requires you to evaluate the answer. Because the source might want to just be anonymous because it's easier. It's threat-free. There's no possibility of repercussion if you're going to protect this person to the grave. And this person wants to get a piece of information out. Well, you're a nice vehicle for doing that. But this suggests that you need to know why. And what if the source says to you, because I'd be uncomfortable if my name were in the paper? Would you grant it then? Anyone? I guess my answer to that, I'm sorry, please, go ahead.
Well, uncomfortable is such a, like, would you have to inquire more, or you can just leave them with that?
I think you're right. I think you'd want to know why uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because you made a promise not to disclose the contents of the meeting. I'm obviously making up an example, but uncomfortable, the most compelling answer is, if I told you, if my name appeared in the paper, I'd be arrested. I'd be indicted. It's against the law. There are some laws that protect information. There are, you might be talking to a police officer, and the police officer might have a legal obligation not to disclose something. And so putting that police officer's name in the paper might get that person in a serious amount of trouble. Fired is also a possibility. The trickier ones are when it might offend someone. It might hurt a friendship. Let's say you're, someone's giving you a document, a letter that he found sitting on a desk, in a government office, and all the other people in that office might really be offended that your source hadn't respected their privacy. At that point, I think what you try to do is you try to persuade that person to take a risk, to say, this story is not going to be as strong if I can't identify the source of the information. You and I have something in common here. We both want to see a strong and believable story in the paper about what you're concerned about and what I'm interested in writing about. But in the end, you may not be successful in that conversation. And then you've got to decide. And, you can always break off and call and ask for advice, but you're the one who's going to be on the point on this, and you're going to have to make a judgment call. And this is one of the reasons, I think, to think about these issues in advance, is that sometimes, you're making a decision at midnight, far from the office, in a conversation that's been going on for hours, and you've just gotten to the point where you think you're going to get a valuable piece of information, and now you've got to make a decision. Are you willing to take that next step in order to get it? And so that's the reason to think about these things before it's midnight and you have to make that decision. In general, I would say that if the person's reason, the compelling reason for insisting on anonymity is that one would, face a prosecution, one would lose a job, those to me are easy ones. The harder ones are when it would offend, when it would rupture a friendship. I think you can't force a person, to put their name in the paper. You can't force them to do it, but you can talk to them about, what the other side is. Because often a source won't have thought about how insisting on anonymity will compromise the story. So you need to sort of be clear as to what the ramifications are for the story as well, and see if that causes the source to relent on insisting on anonymity. All right, the next piece here, it says the reporter and editor must be satisfied that the source has a sound factual basis for his or her assertions. Some sources quoted anonymously might tend to exaggerate or overreach precisely because they will not be named. Okay, this is another kind of gut check question, because a source, once you say, all right, just tell me, I'll protect you, I'll go to jail for you, I'll do anything for you, just tell me what it is that happened. Well, now this is open season, I mean, now you've said you can tell me anything and I'm on the hook for it. And there's a tendency by people who have a piece of private information to kind of show it off. So you need to be careful that you're not allowing the pledge of anonymity to distort in some way. And it's all the more important because it's going to be hard for you to, you're going to try to check this information. There's an obligation on you to check it, but sometimes it's going to be impressionistic. Sometimes there's not going to be an absolute, the words that were spoken that you might want to put in the piece that the anonymous source tells you. Everyone might agree on the words, but let's say he's relaying a secret meeting somewhere. Some people might think the words were spoken in anger. Some people might think the words were spoken in jest. Some people might, people will genuinely, honestly hear things differently. And once you've promised anonymity, you don't have the ability to say, one council member heard it this way and the other council member heard it that way, because you can't say where you got it. So you're not only are the facts of whatever you're reporting going to be something that you're now going to be responsible for, but some of the impressions too. So you need to press, and sources could lie to you too. So you need to press to make sure, if you're describing a meeting to me, where was the meeting? What time was the meeting? Who was in the meeting? How long did it go? When did it get out? Ask easy questions. Who sat where at the table? Who left the meeting first? Was everyone present when the exchange that we're talking about occurred? If it's a document, if the sources gave you a document, how did you get the document? How many copies are there of the document? Why was it ordered? Who produced it? Who gave it to you? Were you asked to return your copy or did you keep your copy? There are things that you can do to suss out whether the source is got a really strong basis for what they're saying or whether they're bullshitting you. And you just need to be, that's important, by the way, in any questioning of any source, but it's especially important if you're going to not be disclosing who the source is. Because if you're disclosing who the source is, the next day when it runs and it says, Bob Smith, councilman, says it happened this way, and Jane Doe, councilwoman, says it happened that way, at least they're accountable for it publicly. In the absence of their names, there's no way to do that. Next, stories should identify sources as completely as possible, consistent with the promise of anonymity. In particular, a source's point of view and potential biases should be disclosed as fully as possible. For instance, an advisor to Democratic members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is preferable to a congressional source. Seems pretty obvious. I call this the sort of common sense clause. For most readers, by the way, that information is going to be more important than the name. Because I don't know the names of any advisors to Democratic members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So if we ran the name, Steve Smith said X, X or Y, that means I doesn't disclose any predisposition or bias to me as a reader. What does is knowing where the person is located. And that might not be perfect either. Right? Some advisors to Democratic members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will disagree with each other. So it doesn't mean that you've completely got a clear hit on it, but at least it lets you know where this person is probably coming from. So if an advisor to Democratic members says one thing, and then you go and you check it with an advisor to Republican members, now you've got a couple of sources triangulating each other. You're beginning to get a more complete picture. And if they agree and they describe the events or the documents similarly or identically, then you're making headway. And you're able to show to readers that you're not just relying on people who are anonymous and who are using their anonymity to try to advance an agenda or to hurt an opponent or whatever. You're disclosing something of value to them. Okay, next. This is a tough one. When practical, a reporter should consult an editor before entering into an agreement to protect a source's anonymity. In some cases, an editor may insist on knowing the source's identity in order to evaluate the reliability of the information provided. In rare instances, sources may insist that the paper and the reporter resist subpoenas and judicial orders if necessary to protect their anonymity. Reporters should consult a masthead editor before entering into any such agreement. All right, first question, do people here know what a masthead editor is? Okay, well, I'll tell you. On the editorial page of the paper, there is a list of the senior news editors, or the senior editors of the newspaper. It's divided into two pieces. There's the editors who supervise news coverage and editors who supervise opinion coverage. There are, I should have looked it up before I came here today, but I want to say probably 15 or 16 what are called masthead level editors. I'm one, but there are many others, and I work in opinion, and then there's a whole news section there too. The point here being, a reporter who's about to say to a source, I will protect you even if it means going to jail, is about to commit an entire organization to an expensive and controversial possibility. Look no more further than Judy Miller or Matt Cooper. These folks made, and I'm not saying that they didn't do this, I don't know whether they did or not, but the point is, this is not fun and games, this is not sort of a sexy moment in a darkened bar and, with a cop. You're about to hook an entire organization onto your credibility. Ideally, before you do that, you'll ask someone if that's okay. Because, in the worst case scenario, this news organization is going to spend millions of dollars either trying to keep you out of jail or trying to get you out of jail. And it's going to be a big hoopla. So the ideal thing would be in that conversation, wherever it's taking place at whatever hour, is that you stop and you say, okay, I'm prepared to grant you the anonymity that you're after, because I'm persuaded that this is of sufficient import, that it's met all our other tests here. I'm persuaded that you've got a sound factual basis for what you're telling me. I'm persuaded that this is important. I want to do this. Give me a second. I got to make a phone call. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know how often this happens. That's a hard, again, because what the other tension here is you're trying to close the deal. You're trying to get the information, and to stop and say, give me 10 minutes, is to risk the source saying, you know what, this is a fucking nightmare, I'm out of here. And when that happens, then you've wasted the entire thing. So I don't know. I don't know whether reporters are adhering to this strictly at the LA Times or elsewhere, but I do know that they should. Because if you don't, you're really out on a long limb all by yourself. Now, ideally, your news organization will stand up for you no matter what, that you'll enter into that promise and they'll be with you the whole way. Lord knows it's certainly true in both Wen-Ho Lee and the Scooter Libby cases. But it is not without difficulty. And so ideally, you would, and the point of this language saying consult a masthead editor is to say, if we're going to commit the organization, we want people at a high level of experience and regard within the organization to assist in that decision. We don't want this being made by the night city editor, who may be actually more capable of making this decision than a masthead editor, but we want someone for whom the organization is invested in to be part of this decision. That's a hard practical matter, and as I say, I don't know how often it happens, but I do know that it's a good idea. Next, even in the absence of such an agreement, the possibility exists that a prosecutor, grand jury, or judge will demand to know a source's identity, forcing the reporter to choose between unmasking the source and going to jail for contempt of court. Such situations are rare, and they should not deter us from investigating sensitive or contentious matters. All right, this is the be tough graph. This is the, all right, we've warned you that this could be difficult, do it anyway. We don't want to not report news because we're scared of people either going to jail or being put in a difficult legal situation. It is very easy these days, particularly in light of what has happened to some very high-quality journalists. It is easy to just say, I don't want to do this. I'm just going to tell sources, if you want to be anonymous, I don't want to have anything to do with it because it's too complicated and it's too risky. The point of this language is to say, it is risky, it is difficult, it puts the organization on the line, do it anyway. And I can't emphasize that enough because, the Pentagon Papers reporting on the history of the Vietnam War, the Watergate reporting that helped to expose the criminality of the Nixon administration, reporting on police scandals, reporting on government officials at all levels, state, local, federal. A lot of that depends on sources who are only willing to provide either perceptions or documents or other material if they're not going to get identified. And if you freak out in the face of the challenge, you won't get it. And this, I mean, it's easy to be sort of overblown and even corny about this, but the fact is that this is a better country because of investigative reporting that relies on anonymous sources. It is a better country because we as a country were able to learn what Richard Nixon was up to. He was ordering the break-ins of a psychiatrist's office to steal material about the source of the Pentagon Papers. He was, as we all know, attempting to wiretap his political opponents. He was ordering IRS audits, people he didn't like. He had an enemies list. That's important that we know that stuff. And if the only way to get that kind of information is by entering into these very delicate and difficult agreements, well then, God damn it, do it. And any reporter or editor who's afraid to do that really shouldn't be in the business, even though you should be really careful. And that's the real tension here, is to keep those in balance. Not to grant every person who wants anonymity, but also not to be afraid to do it when you should. That's the meat of the argument to me, but there's a little more language here too. Reporters should be extremely circumspect about how and where they store information that might identify an anonymous source. Many electronic records, including email, can be subpoenaed from and retrieved by non-newsroom employees. All right, well, there's two elements to this language. The first is what I talked about already, which is the kind of don't trust your employer aspect of this, which, by the way, it's pretty extraordinary for an employer to put that language in a document like this, because it basically says, we want you to do the right thing, but be careful about what we might do to you at some point. So that's odd in its own right. But it's also a reminder that there's other people. You start sending reporting by email, and you've created a whole bunch of records with your own language and language of your source that can easily be gotten by someone else. So it is intrinsically impossible to do reporting with anonymous sources via email. Should be meeting with people in person wherever possible. There's a lot of reasons for that, by the way. That's important even with sources who are identified. A lot more information is transmitted when you meet someone in person than over the phone, and a lot more information is obtainable over the phone than it is by email. There's inflection. You know, I can't tell you how many times people have disagreed about whether something was said humorously or not. And that happens much less often when the encounter is in person. You know, I mean, the best thing you can do is go find the sources you want to talk to, go find them. Go talk to them, you know, I mean, sometimes they won't want to talk to you at their office, sometimes it means going to their home, sometimes it means, you know, meeting in a restaurant or whatever. But you will learn much more from a source who you talk to in person. That's true regardless of whether they're anonymous. But what you don't want to be doing is creating a sort of electronic way to expose the source. And if you're sending if you're sending an email to a source saying, I would love to talk to you off the record, meet me at 6 o'clock somewhere, someone's going to get that email. And it might be your employer, or it might be the source's employer, or it might be, you know, the company that, you know, what do you call it, the server or whoever it is. They might get a subpoena, they might reveal it. You've created all kinds of other ways to discover what you're up to. So you need to be circumspect. This goes back to what I said at the outset, that extreme discretion is really what's required in these cases. And finally, promises to a source must be kept except under the most extraordinary circumstances. If a source acting in bad faith were to succeed in using the newspaper to spread misinformation, we would consider our promise of anonymity no longer binding. That said, we do not burn sources. Okay, well, this goes back to what we've been talking about for a couple days now, which is the initial conversation. Part of what you need to say to a source is, our deal here involves me protecting you and you telling the truth, both in what you're about to tell me and going forward. In essence, as long as you're honest, we've got a deal. And as long as you keep being honest, we keep having a deal. But if you don't, then you should know I'm taking a hike. Now, note, and we talked about it the other day, someone was saying that, you know, one argument would be if we thought in the Wenho Lee case, for instance, that the source there was disclosing that information out of malice or out of some ill will toward Lee, that we might want to reconsider the promise. This language would not allow the paper to do that. This does not say that we're no longer going to honor anonymity for a source who breaks the law. There's nothing in here that says that a source who breaks the law causes us to violate the deal. There's nothing in here that says that a source who acts with malice or ill will causes us to break the deal. There's nothing that says that you can't be a jerk or, all of that's permissible under this language. The only thing that this protects is the newspaper being the agent that protects, the only thing that this prevents, rather, is the newspaper ending up being the purveyor of misinformation. And since that's what the newspaper's fundamental business is purveying true information, it's logical to me that that would be the breaking point for us. But so let me ask all of you this. Apply that language to what we've talked about with respect to the Scooter Libby case or Wenho Lee. In either of those instances, do you think the sources would have gotten revealed? Did the sources violate this language, as far as we know? Who? Yeah.
I think maybe in the Wenho Lee case, I don't know. It was never proven that they violated it, but it was pretty close to it.
It's a little hard to know in Lee, right? Because we never learned who the source was, right? But if the source in Lee provided accurate personnel information about Lee, that he or she should not have provided, that it was, let's say it was illegal or at least improper to disclose it, does that violate this language? No. No, I don't think so. What about Miller, or Scooter Libby, rather? Anyone? Well, I would argue no. Scooter Libby, presuming that everyone did what everyone says they did in Libby, Libby, at least with respect to Miller, provided her with the name of a CIA operative who was married to Joe Wilson. Well, that's true. Valerie Plame was, and as far as I know, still is married to Joe Wilson. I don't know that what Libby was saying about her was true. He was trying to argue that Wilson's findings were colored by his relationship with Valerie Plame. I have no reason to believe that's true. And it's also true that what Libby did and was convicted of was illegal in saying that, in disclosing Valerie Plame's name to Judy Miller. But as far as I can tell, he did not, as this language say, if he was not acting in bad faith and succeeding in using the newspaper to spread misinformation. He was using the newspaper, attempting to use the newspaper, to spread true information, just information that was illegal to disclose. To my mind, I think a news organization that was trying to live under this language would continue to protect the anonymity of both Libby and whoever the source was in Wenho Lee. In the case of Wenho Lee, there was an LA Times reporter who was, the LA Times is among the organizations that was a party to that suit, or that was where the reporter was subpoenaed in connection with the suit. And the reporter did not disclose the name. To my mind, that was appropriate and in conformance with the language here. All right, so that takes us to the end of the LA Times guidelines in this area. But I also wanted to present to you a case study that's a little different. And it really on this question of what happens when a source tries to use a newspaper to spread misinformation. And this involves two reporters who work for the San Francisco Chronicle and who covered the Balco case. Some of you sports fans especially may know about this. This is the I forget what Balco stands for, but it's a Bay Area something cooperative that was accused of supplying various athletes with steroids or drugs that were forbidden in their sports. It was particularly a big story in San Francisco because among the athletes who were accused of going to Balco for steroids were Jason Giambi of the New York Yankees and, big deal in the Bay Area, Barry Bonds of the San Francisco Giants. My team, incidentally. These two reporters did a huge amount of investigative work on the issue of steroids in baseball. They wrote a book called Game of Shadows, and they covered it extensively for the San Francisco Chronicle. Among the information that's included, both in their newspaper coverage and in their book, is testimony from people who appeared before the grand jury that was taking evidence in this case, including the testimony of both Giambi and Barry Bonds. So the judge who was then involved in the case, in May of 2006, ordered these two reporters to go before a grand jury and reveal who their source of the grand jury, of the information about the grand jury testimony was. The San Francisco Chronicle, understandably, objected, and there was a hearing on it, as you would expect. In August of 2006, the judge ruled that the government had the right to the information, and that the government's right to the information about who the source was outweighed the reporter's claim that they had a privilege to protect the source. I'll pause here just to note one issue of the law, which I sort of skipped through the other day, but it comes really home to roost here. These are reporters who are working in California, and California has a very strong shield law that says that reporters in California may protect their sources. And that in most instances, the government does not have a right to overwhelm that information and require overwhelm that privilege and have a reporter reveal the source. This is why this is very complicated, though, that there is no federal shield law, because this is a case, although all the facts of it occur in California, it's being tried in federal court, where there is no shield law. So even though these reporters would have been protected if this case had been in state court, the fact that it was in federal court made their position much more problematic. So they argued this case in August of 2006, and they lose. In September, they're ordered to go to jail. The judge did agree, however, to stay their reporting to jail, meaning to sort of postpone their reporting to jail, while they could appeal it up to the Ninth Circuit, which is the court of appeal for California and the West. In August, the following month, the Chronicle acknowledged in court that it was in continuing contempt of the court, that its reporters had been ordered to disclose this information, and they were continuing to refuse. They were levied $1,000 a day in fines for their continuing contempt. That too was stayed, but so now this is becoming problematic for the reporters, and it's starting to get expensive for the newspaper. I mean, $1,000 a day, newspapers can handle that, but you do that over enough days, and it starts to be a drag. This all continues to argue out through the fall as the appeal was being prepared and into 2007. And then in February of 2007, a lawyer by the name of Troy Ellerman, who was representing one of the Balco executives, admits that he's the one who gave them the grand jury material. They never say a word, by the way. This goes back to the other day we were talking about Libby and Libby waiving and giving Judy Miller the right to disclose him. And I said at the time that my preference in that would have been for Libby simply to admit it rather than asking her to admit it. This guy did that. He comes out and says, it's me. What gets really complicated, though, about this case is that Ellerman, after having let them take notes on the grand jury material, then they write about it. Then he goes into court and says, my client should be freed because someone else is leaking information that's damaging to his case. So he's continuing to lie about this and doing so in a way that the leak itself, he's leaking, then lying about the leak to help his client, knowing full well that he's the source of it. That's pretty bad. I mean, if you go back to the hypothetical we had the other day, I talked about a councilman who gave some information and then called a press conference and lied about it. This is at least as bad as that, in that he's using the leak for a strategic purpose and accusing others of doing it specifically to try to get his client off. And I have to say, what is really problematic about this, I think from a journalistic ethics perspective, is that now these reporters are protecting a source who they know is manipulating them and lying to achieve a legal end. Now, the happy news here is that Troy Ellerman was sent to jail. In July of 2007, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. He just, actually, I read in one of the clips preparing for today that he got out in September of 2009, so apparently he's free again. My advice to you would be not to hire him if you're in legal trouble. I think he probably has been disbarred at this point. But the reason I mention this whole episode to you is that in some ways, this is the sort of worst case scenario. My own view is that this it has much deeper ethical implications than either the Scooter Libby case or the Wenho Lee case. Because here, the reporters are protecting something. Not only are they protecting a source who may be up to no good, but their coverage is serving that source's attempt to do no good, to do something wrong. So back to the LA Times language, let me just read it again, and let me ask you if anyone here thinks that this episode would not have violated this. If a source acting in bad faith were to succeed in using the newspaper to spread misinformation, we would consider our promise of anonymity no longer binding. That apply here? Who? Anyone? Yeah.
Well, I mean, does that have to be like something that you have to state to the source, or is that just something that's like understood, just left by everyone?
Excellent question. I have no idea what the Chronicle's rules on this were. I think if the initial promise to the source, and I'm guessing this is what it was, but let me stress, I don't know. If the initial promise was, you let us see the material, we'll protect you to the grave, then they got to do that. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that. The question is, should that have been the promise?
Under what conviction did Elmer go to jail?
Good question. I assume that there was some sort of order not to disclose grand jury material, and that he violated that order. And there may well have been, in fact, I'm sure there was, although I'd have to look it up. I'll bet there was questions posed to all the parties, did you release it, and probably denials. And so at some level there is probably a violation either of a court order or an obstruction charge or something like that, would be my guess. Yeah.
I think in this case, it's kind of a catch-22 because he never really supplied misinformation, right? Like everything he supplied was true.
That's
Now,
correct.
He was acting in bad faith because he had his own agenda, but he didn't supply any misinformation, did he?
I think you're absolutely right, except for one instance. I think as far as I know, there's no misinformation in the grand jury transcripts. They were accurate reflections of what people testified to, and as far as I know, they've never been denied. But when he denies it, that he's the source, and accuses someone, argues in behalf of his motion for dismissal of the case, that the leaks by others are hurting his client, that's an act of misinformation. So you're right that the initial leak of the material may not be misinformation, but the subsequent handling of it may be. Yes?
So why did he admit that he was the one that gave the reporters the grand jury testimony?
Good question.
After he'd already accused them of, oh, you're ruining my client's work.
I don't think he accused them. He suggested to others that in court that the leaks, presumably by others, were hurting his client. So he wasn't suggesting that the reporters did something wrong. He was suggesting that other people were leaking information to hurt his client. But the reporters knew that not to be correct because they'd sat there and at his behest, copied this information down. So why did he come forward? Good question. I mean, guilt, a guilty conscience, the fact that they were about to go to jail. You like to believe that to be the case. There's a whole other way to talk about this case, which is about his legal ethics and his responsibility to his client, and whether this helped his client. How far, as a lawyer, are you allowed to go in the service of your client? I'd rather not crack that can of worms because I don't even know the answers. But in the end, Scooter Libby allowed Judy Miller to disclose who he was. In the end, this guy came forward. I think it must be difficult for people to see people you've worked with take the fall for you. I guess I like to believe that's what motivated him here, but I'm happy to say I've never spoken to him. Anyone else? Yeah.
Did he specifically call out others, or did you just say like others were leaking?
I don't know. I don't believe that he ever specifically accused another person.
In which case, he's not technically lying. Others who happen to be me leaking information.
I think the word "other" implies not me. I mean, I think that's the sort of what does the word "is" mean? I think if you are seeking the dismissal of a case against your client because of damage done to your client by leaks, and you're responsible for the leaks, you're engaged in a pretty disingenuous business, and I think there's no doubt but that was the case here. Yeah, right, exactly. Well, legal ethics are another conversation for another day. Yes.
Have you ever used an anonymous source that you felt violated the promise that you had or the agreement that you had with them?
The question is whether I've ever used a source who violated the promise. I don't think so. I have had instances where a source I have used has been unhappy about the way I identified the source, in other words, by position, or where I wish I had had a more specific conversation up front with the source about how I was going to do that. In the end, as far as I know, I have never used an anonymous source who's been identified. You know, I don't think, I can also think of one instance where there was a piece of information, this is in the Simpson case, in fact, where I wish the source and I had talked a little more about what the information was we were going to report. It was a piece of evidence in the case. And it was not wrong, but if I'd asked a few more questions, I would have been able to be more specific with the information. That was really on my side, though, it wasn't a failure of the source. It was hurrying and trying to get information quickly. It has to do, I don't think there's any reason why I can't be more specific on this. It had to do with the question, you know, there were blood drops found at the scene of the Brentwood scene of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman's murder, and there were also blood drops in his car and other places. And the question, and some of them typed, ultimately DNA typed, although I think at the time I was writing the story, the DNA evidence wasn't in yet, to Simpson. They seemed to match Simpson. And I wish that I had asked the source more about, Simpson had cuts. He had, I think, a cut on his hand. In fact, I know he had a cut on his hand. I wish I'd asked more about whether Simpson had injuries that were consistent with the blood drops that were found. But that's a matter of detail. It is true that Simpson was cut and therefore could have been responsible for those drops of blood. But the source didn't give me misinformation. I just wish I'd gotten more. I mean, you can tell I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but I don't think that I've ever had an instance where I felt a source, an anonymous source, used his or her anonymity to lie. Yeah.
When you were writing writing on the Simpson case, was it like, because I know we were talking about bias before and how you can't like pretty much give your opinion, but like, okay, so the general consensus was that he was guilty, so when you were writing, like, were you just stating like, oh, well, this person said this and this person said this? And, like,
Well, you know, there's phases of that case. Murders occurred, I think it was June of '94. Actually, it was at my brother's law school graduation when the murder occurred, and I was flying back home. There were a few, it was a relatively short amount of time, I think a week or so, between the murders and Simpson's arrest. So there was a short period there, and I was covering the LAPD at the time, where I was covering it as a police matter. And then there was a very long period of time where I was covering it as a trial. It seemed like a very long period of time. In that first few days as a police matter, it was a matter of trying to report on what evidence the police had accumulated. Simpson had a lawyer, and so there were people to talk to on the Simpson side of things. And as various pieces of evidence got collected and analyzed, then it wasn't so much a matter of saying X thinks he's guilty, Y thinks he's not guilty. It was, you know, blood drops were found at the scene. Police think that means that the cut on his hand, or, you know, that his cuts were responsible for that. You know, others, you know, close to him say that he had no injuries that could have left that amount of blood. Or, you know, in other words, I'm not remembering the specifics precisely, but the point is, it wasn't so much he's guilty, he's not guilty. It's we found this, we think it means that, we think it means this. And that was largely true throughout the trial too. You know, I mean, for instance, there was a pair of socks. God, this all just takes me back. Sorry. There was a pair of socks found in his bedroom, and there was blood on the socks that the DNA was, you know, identified as likely being that of Nicole Simpson. So the question is, how does the blood of Nicole Simpson get into O.J. Simpson's bedroom? You know, there are basically two answers, or even three to that. One, that he killed her and got blood on his socks. Two, that the samples were stored improperly in such a way that blood from other samples got onto the socks, so that the handling of the evidence was so careless that it could have resulted in a false, a false typing. Or 3, that the police did it deliberately, that they planted evidence in Simpson's bedroom in order to convict him. Well, you know, when covering the trial, all 3 of those ideas were presented, and we covered all 3 of them as ideas before the jury, and we covered the arguments, and I wrote about, you know, what different people interpreted it as being. I don't think there's any necessity in that to reach a conclusion. Indeed, I didn't know, I mean, to this day, I can't tell you whether they were stored properly or not, or whether, I have doubts about, and I think our coverage at the time reflected doubts about the police conspiracy theory for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that if you're planting evidence at a time when you don't know where the suspect might have been, you expose yourself to great danger. If it turned out, I mean, if you're a cop and you're, you know, dabbing blood on a sock in Simpson's bedroom so it'll be found in the morning, and then it turns out that Simpson was at a Laker game on television, you know, the night before, then someone's going to ask, well, then how did this get you know? I mean, so there was a lot. That theory, I think, was more difficult than the theory that evidence was mishandled. And I think we tried to report on that skeptically and point out the difficulties in the theories, but without reaching any ultimate conclusion. And that goes back to our conversation the other day about objectivity and the need to write in a kind of neutral way. All right, so any more on Balco? Yeah.
The problem I see in these cases is like with the plane and the scooter libby issue in Judy Miller, the end all and be all was that the crime was committed in the conversation. I could understand it protecting the source. But with the Win O'Lee case, and you mentioned that you didn't think it violated this principle of misinformation being spread. But beyond that, there is a crime that is committed that affects someone beyond the people that were originally involved in the conversation and in the original contract. And I don't know how I could justify protecting someone who ended up committing a crime that is involving other people. In the Balco case, I don't know if that goes on. If he accused people and then I continue to protect their source and the lawyer, Elvin, or whoever it was, accuse people and then those people are, you know, are charged or investigated, then of course I would say that you have to come forward. Ethically, I don't know if I could sit and, you know, maybe it's a conscious thing and watch other people suffer because of that, even if it didn't violate this clause or principle.
Well, I think you put your finger on what is a really difficult quandary that emerges for reporters who are in that situation. I mean, in some ways, the misinformation out is the easiest because it violates the kind of core tenet of being a journalist, which is that you are there to tell the truth. And you are there to catch other people when they don't tell the truth. And suddenly, if you've boxed yourself in a situation where your obligation to your source requires you to be silent while they lie, then that's a problem. And your own paper is going to be writing about it. So your own paper then is going to be purveying that lie. That's why there is a sort of specific out in our guidelines for misinformation. But you're right, there's all kinds of other things that may be uncomfortable to sit by and watch people do. I don't know whether it was uncomfortable for Judy Miller to watch Scooter Libby sit silently as the country tried to figure out who the source of this was, but I bet it was. And that whole time, she knew he'd broken the law. So in a sense, her insistence on protecting her source could have allowed a criminal, arguably criminal, at least alleged criminal, to go free. And in that case, one with really pretty significant national security implications.
If you identify someone else, which, you know, could have happened, and this becomes a burden on his or her life, then I would think it's my responsibility to say, this is the source. I made a mistake, and now I resign and deal with the consequences of that.
You know, I mean, in the end, no guideline can force you not to do what your conscience compels you to do. And that's, you know, that's a really hard moment for a journalist. It would probably be your last moment as a journalist. But, you know, there are instances where I think it's, as human beings, we just feel like we can't let certain things go without our assistance. There are some instances, even in California shield law, which is quite strong, as I mentioned, there are instances where a reporter will be compelled to give a piece of evidence. There's I'm going to forget again the precise circumstances of the case, but there's a case where an LA Times reporter was on a ride-along with a police officer and reported on an arrest. And I believe it's the person who was arrested argued that he or she had been roughed up by the police, and the reporter never wrote about it. But they wanted the reporter to come to court and testify about what happened. Initially, we resisted it, the Times resisted it, that is, by saying it didn't appear in the paper, the reporter shouldn't have to give evidence on it. As it turns out, then the court ruled no, because this defendant has a Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial, which is, at least in this case, more compelling than your First Amendment right to protect unpublished information. The sort of sad denouement of all that is that the reporter went in and testified that the police didn't rough him up. So, there was this long sort of theoretical legal battle that resulted in kind of nothing. But, imagine that circumstance. Imagine that that you learned of something in your reporting that for whatever reason you didn't put in the paper, or you didn't want, let's say a police source said, you know what, we framed Simpson. I can tell you off the record, we framed him. No one ever told me that, by the way. But let's say someone had told me that, and I had written a story, and I'd confirmed it with other blah, 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 whatever, done all the traps, and then, a judge wanted to know, is it true? I want to know who told you that. That'd be a hell of a difficult situation, And, I think there are, as I say, we are journalists, yes, but people too. And there can come moments where your conscience may compel you to do something that these guidelines or your own sense of journalistic ethics wouldn't cover, in which case you got to be a person. I hope it doesn't happen. Yeah.
Perhaps something that even makes this a more complicated decision is if you have a source that is committing some sort of illegal act by telling you something, and you're obligated to protect them, and you're obstructing in some way justice, are there implications for a reporter who won't tell a source, as far as maybe like aiding a criminal goes, or conspiracy charges or anything like that you won't tell?
I mean, I'm not aware of cases that have reached kind of that precipice. But you listen, I mean, reporters commit crimes too. I mean, there's not like a crime-free area around reporters. Reporters as reporters, but also reporters just as people occasionally commit crimes and go to jail for them. I mean, you cannot, as a general principle, you cannot use your profession to shield yourself from criminal prosecution. I mean, so if you are reporting on, drug trafficking in, South LA, and you, in order to get to the bottom of it, you start buying and selling drugs, and you get caught, you don't have a First Amendment right to buy and sell drugs. And so, this comes up occasionally in the context of sort of undercover reporting, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in the class. But I would just say, every case is a little bit different, but in general, you can't do something illegal just because you're a reporter and expect that will get you out of trouble. So it might go to your intent. If there was some crime where the issue was what was your intent, if your intent is to write a story, that might be different than if your intent was to hurt someone. But in the end, the law is law, and you have to kind of deal with that. Yes?
Before you were saying that you would never yourself steal a document, but you wouldn't stop a source from stealing a document, and then wouldn't that be illegal for you obtaining a stolen item?
That's a good question. I don't think I said I wouldn't object to a source stealing a document. I said I wouldn't object to taking a document if a source had stolen it. But the point being, and I realize I'm being a little fine here, but there's a difference between asking someone to do something illegal and then, in my mind, and then receiving the benefit of something that was previously done that was illegal. But yes, is there an argument that, for instance, the New York Times, by accepting the Pentagon Papers, which were stolen, that they accepted stolen property? Yeah, there's an argument. Now, should they not have done it for that reason? I mean, I guess I would argue that if Daniel Ellsberg shows up on my doorstep with a copy of the Pentagon Papers, I'm going to let him in, and I'm going to urge my newspaper to publish them.
So no journalist has ever been tried for...
Well, I don't want to say no journalist has ever been tried for it. Someone's been tried for everything. Listen, there would be a legal argument that if that's stolen material, that you received it knowingly. Now, it's not like receiving, a color television set. It's of a different character, and the news organization would have a pretty strong defense of it. But it does get you into a gray area for sure. We're about done, but did you have one more question?
This was the
first case of, the source actually was sentenced to jail for longer than, the reporter that we've talked about.
Right, right.
And like before, it puzzled me that, you know, like, Libby wasn't sentenced to jail and, you know, the other source wasn't discovered, but that also was true. So is it simply because this was taken to the federal court that we can have?
Actually, no. Libby was, in fact, sentenced to jail. President Bush commuted the sentence. So that the lesson in Libby is that, yes, you can be prosecuted, yes, you can be sentenced, but if you have a good friend of the president, might be okay. So that's the oddity that let Libby spend less time. But Libby was, in fact, sentenced to jail and would have gone to jail had he not been commuted.
But like the time of the source, it just completely depends on state laws.
Depends on the rules, exactly. All right, look forward to seeing you Tuesday. Don't forget to get a copy of this complaint on your way out. Have a nice weekend.